What would you do if the person you trusted most kicked you while you were 7 months pregnant, in front of 1,000 people? With cameras rolling, Victoria thought her fairy tale marriage to billionaire Garrett Morrison was perfect until one brutal night destroyed everything. But what she discovered next was even more shocking. A conspiracy so twisted, so calculated, that it would make your blood boil. This isn't just a story about betrayal. It's about a woman who lost everything and then systematically destroyed the empire that tried to bury her. If you've ever felt powerless against someone with money and influence, you need to hear how Victoria turned the tables. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story of revenge that will restore your faith in justice. And don't forget to subscribe because trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. The sterile hospital room felt like a tomb. Victoria Hayes lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling tiles while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. 7 months pregnant just yesterday. Today, empty arms and a hollow heart. The door creaked open. Victoria turned, hoping against hope to see Garrett's familiar face. Instead, a nurse entered with discharge papers. "Mrs. Morrison, you're cleared to go home," the nurse said gently. "Is someone coming to pick you up?" Victoria's throat constricted. "My husband should be here soon." But she knew better. Garrett Morrison, Silicon Valley's golden boy, wouldn't darken this hospital doorway. Not after what happened at the gala. Not after the video went viral. Not after she lost their baby. How had it come to this 6 years ago? Victoria Hayes was a beloved third-grade teacher in small-town Ohio. She lived in a cramped apartment above the bakery on Main Street, grading papers by lamplight and dreaming of the family she'd someday have. Her biggest worry was whether she could afford new classroom supplies. Then came the Education Technology Conference in Chicago. Victoria attended hoping to learn about new teaching tools. Instead, she met Garrett Morrison at the hotel bar, 29 years old, brilliant, and overflowing with confidence about his revolutionary learning app. "Teachers like you are going to change everything," he told her that first night, his blue eyes intense with passion. "This app will help millions of kids, but I need someone who understands education from the inside." Victoria was captivated, not just by his vision, but by how he listened when she spoke, how he valued her insights, how he made her feel important. 3 months later, she quit teaching and moved to California to help launch EduTech Solutions. She believed in Garrett's dream so completely that she gave up everything for it. The early days were magical. They worked 18-hour days in a cramped garage office, surviving on coffee and takeout pizza. Victoria handled customer service, wrote educational content, and tested the app with local schools. Garrett coded and pitched to investors. When EduTech's learning platform exploded across America's classrooms, Victoria felt like they'd conquered the world together. The IPO made them worth $300 million overnight. They married in a fairy tale ceremony featured in Tech Weekly magazine. "We did this together," Garrett whispered during their first dance. "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Victoria believed him. She thought their love story was just beginning. But success changed Garrett. The shy programmer who once valued her opinion became distant and dismissive. The man who called her his partner started treating her like an employee, then like a burden. The first crack appeared 2 years into their marriage. Victoria found diamond earrings in their bedroom that weren't hers. When she confronted Garrett, he exploded. "You're being paranoid and insecure," he snapped. "Success means networking with beautiful, intelligent women. If you can't handle that, maybe you should go back to Ohio." Victoria swallowed her suspicions and tried harder to be the perfect tech wife. She attended networking events, smiled for cameras, and stayed quiet when Garrett took credit for ideas that were originally hers. But the distance grew. Garrett worked later, traveled more, and barely spoke to her at home. When Victoria got pregnant last spring, she thought a baby would bring them closer. Instead, it drove them further apart. Now, sitting in this hospital bed with empty arms, Victoria faced the brutal truth. Her fairy tale marriage had been a lie, and everyone in America knew it. The discharge nurse returned with a wheelchair. "Ready, Mrs. Morrison?" Victoria nodded, though ready was the last thing she felt. As they wheeled her toward the exit, she glimpsed the television in the waiting room. Her own face filled the screen, frozen in a moment of pure agony as she tumbled down the gala stairs. The chyron read, "Tech billionaire's wife suffers miscarriage after public confrontation." Victoria closed her eyes. The real nightmare was just beginning. Victoria's Uber pulled up to the mansion in Atherton, Silicon Valley's most exclusive neighborhood. The Spanish colonial estate sprawled across 2 acres, complete with infinity pool, tennis court, and a view of the San Francisco Bay that made visitors gasp. Victoria had once loved this house. Now it felt like a mausoleum. She paid the driver with one of the few credit cards still working and walked slowly up the marble steps. Her body ached from the miscarriage, but her heart hurt worse. The front door opened before she could reach for her key. Well. The star of the show returns. Amber Cross stood in the doorway wearing Victoria's silk robe. The 24-year-old influencer looked perfectly put together despite the early morning hour. Her blonde hair cascaded in beachy waves, and her makeup was Instagram ready. "Where's Garrett?" Victoria asked quietly. "Emergency board meeting? Damage control." Amber smirked. "Your little scene cost the company $30 million in market cap." Victoria pushed past her into the foyer. The house felt different. Amber's things were everywhere. Designer handbags on the entry table, expensive shoes by the door, a laptop covered with lifestyle brand stickers. "You moved in," Victoria said flatly. "Garrett thought it was best. Given the circumstances." Amber followed her into the living room. "He's worried about your mental state. The way you embarrassed yourself last night was honestly tragic." Victoria sank onto the white leather couch where she and Garrett had once planned their future. The irony wasn't lost on her. This couch cost more than her annual teacher's salary used to be. "I lost our baby," Victoria whispered. Amber's expression didn't change. "Garrett's devastated, obviously, but maybe it's for the best. Bringing a child into this toxic situation wouldn't be fair to anyone." The casual cruelty took Victoria's breath away. She stared at this girl who'd destroyed her marriage and showed no remorse. "How long?" Victoria asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been sleeping with my husband?" Amber perched on the arm of the opposite chair like a cat claiming territory. "Does it matter? The important thing is that Garrett's happy now. He's with someone who understands his world. Someone who enhances his brand instead of dragging it down." Victoria felt something crack inside her chest. Not break entirely, but fracture. "Get out." "Excuse me. This is my house, too. Get out." Amber laughed, a bright tinkle that might have sounded charming to others but felt like nails on a chalkboard to Victoria. "Actually, it's not. Check the property records. Garrett transferred the deed to an LLC last month. You have no legal claim here." The words hit like a physical blow. Victoria remembered signing papers Garrett said were tax documents. She'd trusted him completely. "You have until noon to pack your things," Amber continued. "Garrett's lawyer will be in touch about the divorce. He's prepared to be generous, assuming you cooperate." Victoria stood on shaking legs. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not really our problem, is it?" Amber examined her manicured nails. "Maybe your parents in Ohio, and I'm sure they'd love to have their daughter back." Victoria's parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago. Garrett knew this. Apparently, he'd shared that information with his mistress, who was now using it as a weapon. "I'll fight this," Victoria said, though her voice lacked conviction. "With what lawyer, what money?" Amber's smile was poisonous. "Honey, you signed a prenup. You get nothing except what Garrett chooses to give you. And right now, given how you've damaged his reputation, he's not feeling particularly generous." Victoria climbed the stairs to the master bedroom she'd shared with Garrett for 3 years. Her clothes had been moved to the guest room. Amber's belongings filled the walk-in closet where Victoria's wedding dress still hung. She sat on the guest bed and pulled out her phone. Social media was a disaster. The video of her confrontation with Garrett had been viewed 20 million times. Comments ranged from sympathetic to vicious. Poor woman. She deserved better. Attention-seeking gold digger got what she deserved. Why would she embarrass herself like that? Garrett Morrison is trash for treating a pregnant woman that way. Victoria's hands shook as she scrolled through the reactions. Some strangers defended her, but others were ruthless. They dissected her appearance, her background, her worthiness to be married to a billionaire. She found herself thinking about that moment when everything changed. Have you ever been in a situation where you trusted someone completely, only to realize they'd been plotting against you all along? That moment when your entire reality shifts, and you realize the person you loved never actually existed. Victoria was living that nightmare in front of the entire world. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Victoria, I'm Jacob Winters, an attorney specializing in high-profile divorces. I saw what happened last night. You need representation immediately. Call me. Victoria stared at the message. Maybe there was hope after all. Jacob Winters looked like Central Casting's idea of a high-powered attorney. Perfectly styled salt and pepper hair, Italian suit, and a corner office overlooking downtown San Francisco. His law firm occupied 3 floors of one of the city's most prestigious buildings. Mrs. Morrison, I'm so sorry for your loss, Jacob said, offering Victoria a seat in front of his mahogany desk. What happened to you is unconscionable. Victoria sat carefully, still sore from the miscarriage. Can you help me? Absolutely. I've been following your husband's business practices for months. Garrett Morrison isn't the golden boy everyone thinks he is. Jacob opened a thick file. I have evidence of financial irregularities, SEC violations, and breach of fiduciary duty. Victoria leaned forward. What kind of evidence? Jacob spread documents across his desk. Bank statements, email printouts, financial records. Your husband has been using EduTech as his personal piggy bank. Lavish trips charged to the company. A $2 million condo he bought for Miss Cross, funded through a shell company. Private jet flights for personal use, all written off as business expenses. The SEC allows business trips, Victoria said uncertainly. Not when the trips are to romantic getaways with your mistress. Not when you're billing shareholders for your affair. Jacob's voice hardened. Garrett's been defrauding investors for over a year. This evidence would destroy him. Victoria stared at the papers. Financial documents had always confused her, but these numbers looked damning even to her untrained eye. What do you want in return? She asked. Standard contingency fee, 30% of whatever settlement we secure. But Victoria, I think we can get you $50 million, maybe more. Enough to start over with dignity. $50 million. Victoria tried to process the number. It was more money than she could spend in a lifetime. More than that, it was justice. There's one other thing, Jacob continued. I've been contacted by a journalist at the Wall Street Journal, Cole Harper. He's investigating tech industry corruption and wants to interview you. With your permission, I'd like to coordinate our legal strategy with his expose. Victoria nodded. Whatever it takes, Jacob smiled. Excellent. Cole wants to meet tomorrow. In the meantime, I'll file a restraining order to keep you in the house. They can't just throw you out like garbage. That afternoon, Victoria felt hope for the first time since the gala. Jacob's confidence was infectious, and the evidence seemed overwhelming. She imagined Garrett's face when he realized she wasn't going to disappear quietly. She was in the kitchen making tea when Garrett finally came home. He looked haggard, his usually perfect hair disheveled, his tie loosened. Victoria, his voice was carefully neutral. How are you feeling? How do you think I'm feeling? She didn't turn around. Garrett moved to the kitchen island, keeping distance between them. I'm sorry about the baby. I know how much you wanted children. We wanted children. Or at least, I thought we did. Things got complicated. Victoria finally faced him. Her husband looked older than his 35 years. Stress lines etched around his eyes. Part of her still loved him, which made everything harder. When did you stop loving me? She asked quietly. Garrett's composure cracked slightly. I never stopped caring about you, but we grew apart. You didn't understand the pressures I was under. The business world is brutal. Victoria, I needed someone who could handle it. Someone like Amber. Amber gets it. She understands social media, influencer culture, building a brand. Those things matter now. Victoria felt that familiar crack in her chest widen. So I wasn't sophisticated enough for your new life. That's not what I meant. Then what did you mean? Garrett ran his hands through his hair. Look, I know last night got out of hand. I was stressed about the board meeting and I reacted badly. But you ambushed me at the gala. Victoria, in front of investors and journalists, you put me in an impossible position. I put you in an impossible position. Victoria's voice rose. I was trying to stand next to my husband at a public event. I was 7 months pregnant with your child. You were creating a scene. I was existing. God forbid your pregnant wife should exist in the same space as your mistress. Garrett's jaw tightened. Don't be dramatic. Dramatic. Victoria slammed her mug on the counter, shattering it. You pushed me downstairs in front of 1,000 people. I lost our baby. Garrett. How is that dramatic? You're being emotional. The dismissal was like a slap. Victoria stared at this man she'd sacrificed everything for and realized she was looking at a stranger. I want a divorce, she said quietly. Fine, but my lawyer will be in touch. Garrett walked toward the door, then stopped. For what it's worth, I never meant for things to end this way. But you're not sorry they did. He didn't answer, which was answer enough. After he left, Victoria called Jacob Winters. I'm ready, she said. Do whatever you have to do. Consider it done by tomorrow morning. Garrett Morrison is going to regret the day he crossed you. Victoria hung up feeling something she hadn't experienced in months' power. She had no idea she was walking into a trap. Cole Harper looked nothing like Victoria expected. The Wall Street Journal investigative reporter was barely 30, with unruly brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a graduate student than a hard-hitting journalist. They met at a quiet cafe in Palo Alto, away from the tech industry's usual haunts. Cole had chosen a corner table where they could speak privately. Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Cole said, pulling out a digital recorder. I know this must be incredibly difficult. Victoria wrapped her hands around her coffee mug for warmth. If my story can prevent other women from going through this, it's worth it. Tell me about the financial irregularities Jacob mentioned. Victoria hesitated. I'm not sure I understand all the details. Garrett handled the business side of things. But you worked for EduTech in the early days, right? You helped build the company. I did the educational content development. I tested the app with schools. I handled customer service. Victoria's voice grew strong as she remembered. I wrote the curriculum guides that teachers loved. That was why the product succeeded. Cole leaned forward. So you contributed significantly to the company's value. I thought so, but Garrett said my contributions weren't really worth equity. He said I was more like a consultant. Even though you worked without salary for 2 years, he said we were investing in our future together. Cole made notes. What about the company finances? Did you have access to bank accounts, credit cards? Garrett managed everything. He said it was too complicated for me to understand. But you signed documents. Victoria shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes Garrett would bring papers home and ask me to sign. He said they were routine corporate filings. Did you read them? The question hung in the air. Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks. I trusted my husband. Cole's expression was sympathetic. Of course you did. That's what marriage is supposed to be about. They talked for another hour. Cole asked detailed questions about EduTech's early days, about Garrett's business practices, about the company's rapid growth. Victoria answered as best she could, though she realized how little she actually knew about the financial side of the business. One last question, Cole said as they prepared to leave. Are you prepared for Garrett to fight back men like him? Don't give up power easily. Jacob says we have enough evidence to destroy him. Cole nodded. Jacob's a good lawyer. He'll take care of you. That evening, Victoria felt optimistic for the first time in weeks. Between Jacob's legal strategy and Cole's journalistic investigation, Garrett's empire was about to crumble. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Victoria, this is Rebecca Sterling. Victoria recognized the name immediately. Rebecca Sterling was Garrett's business partner and the chief financial officer of EduTech, a brilliant, ruthless woman in her mid-40s who terrified most people in Silicon Valley. Ms. Sterling, I'm surprised to hear from you. I think we should meet. There are things about your situation you don't understand. I don't think that's appropriate. Victoria, I'm trying to help you. Garrett is planning to destroy your credibility completely. There's information you need to hear. Victoria hesitated. Rebecca Sterling was the last person she'd expect help from. The woman had barely spoken to her at company events, treating her like decoration rather than Garrett's wife. What kind of information? Not over the phone. Meet me tomorrow. The Fairmont Hotel, 12:30, presidential suite. The line went dead. Victoria stared at her phone. Every instinct told her this was a mistake. But what if Rebecca really did have information that could help her case? She decided to go. The next morning, Victoria dressed carefully in her best suit and took an Uber to the Fairmont. The presidential suite was opulent even by Silicon Valley standards. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the furnishings looked like they belonged in a museum. Rebecca Sterling stood by the windows, impeccably dressed in a charcoal Armani suit. At 45, she was still strikingly beautiful, with steel gray hair pulled into a perfect chignon and sharp green eyes that seemed to see everything. Victoria, thank you for coming. What did you want to tell me? Rebecca gestured to a leather sofa. Sit down. This is going to be difficult to hear. Victoria perched on the edge of the couch, suddenly nervous. Jacob Winters is not who you think he is, Rebecca said without preamble. What do you mean? He's working for me. Has been for 6 months. The words hit Victoria like cold water. That's impossible. Rebecca opened a laptop on the coffee table. 3 days ago, Jacob received $2 million in his business account, paid by a shell company I control. Victoria stared at the bank records on the screen. Jacob's name was clearly visible, along with the deposit amount. This could be faked, Victoria whispered. It could be, but it's not. Rebecca clicked to another screen. Email threads between Jacob and Rebecca, discussing strategy, discussing Victoria, discussing how to handle the situation. Victoria's hands shook as she read the exchanges, Jacob calling her unstable and manageable, Rebecca instructing him to let her think she's winning before pulling the rug out. Why? Victoria's voice was barely audible. Because you're a threat. Not to Garrett, he's an idiot. But to me, to the real power behind EduTech. Victoria looked up sharply. What are you talking about? Rebecca smiled, and for the first time it looked genuine. EduTech was never Garrett's idea. Victoria, it was mine. Rebecca Sterling moved to the windows, her silhouette sharp against the San Francisco skyline. Garrett Morrison is brilliant at coding, adequate at presenting, and completely useless at business strategy. He never could have built EduTech alone. Victoria felt reality shifting beneath her feet again. But he created the app. I watched him code it. He coded what I told him to code. The educational framework, the user interface, the monetization strategy, all mine. Garrett was my front man because Silicon Valley still prefers young male founders to middle-aged women, no matter how qualified. Rebecca returned to the couch, sitting across from Victoria like a therapist delivering a diagnosis. I've been running shell companies and proxy investments for 15 years. I've built and sold 4 successful startups, but I let men take the credit because it was profitable. Garrett was supposed to be my biggest success story. Then why are you telling me this? Because you became a problem I hadn't anticipated. Victoria stared at her. How was I a problem? I helped build the company. Exactly. Rebecca's green eyes were cold. You knew too much about the early days. You remembered conversations, decisions, whose ideas were whose. As long as you were happily married, that didn't matter. But a bitter ex-wife with inside knowledge, that's dangerous. So you arranged for Garrett to have an affair, Rebecca laughed. Oh no, Garrett's wandering eye was entirely natural. Men like him always need validation from younger women. I simply made sure he found the right younger woman. The pieces clicked together in Victoria's mind. Amber works for you, oi. Amber is an aspiring influencer with expensive tastes and flexible morals. I pay her very well to keep Garrett distracted and controllable. The affair was just business. Victoria felt sick. The baby. Did you know about the baby, boy? I knew Garrett didn't want children yet. Too much responsibility. Too much negative impact on his image. I knew the pregnancy would drive him further toward Amber and further from you. And the gala. I suggested Garrett bring Amber as his date. I knew you'd show up eventually. You're too stubborn to hide forever. I also knew Garrett would handle the confrontation badly. He's never been good under pressure. Victoria's voice was hoarse. You orchestrated my miscarriage. I orchestrated a public scandal that would discredit you. The miscarriage was an unfortunate side effect. Rebecca's casual tone made Victoria's skin crawl. This woman had destroyed her life, her marriage, and her unborn child as a business strategy. What about Jacob? That's evidence against Garrett. All real. Garrett has been using company funds inappropriately, but Jacob isn't going to use that evidence to help you. He's going to use it to frame you. Rebecca opened another file on her laptop. Bank statements, forged documents, fake email threads. According to this evidence, you've been embezzling from EduTech for 3 years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones as you got greedy. The affair with Amber drove you over the edge, and you started stealing more aggressively. Victoria stared at the fabricated evidence. It was sophisticated, detailed, convincing. Someone had spent months creating a paper trail that made her look guilty of massive financial fraud. This is insane. I never had access to company accounts. You had access to Garrett's laptop. You knew his passwords. You signed documents without reading them. Any prosecutor will believe you could have figured out how to move money. But I didn't. Of course you didn't. But by the time Jacob's finished, 12 jurors will believe you did. You'll go to prison for 20 years while Garrett and I continue running EduTech. Victoria felt the walls closing in. What do you want? I want you to disappear. Quietly, Jacob will approach you in a few days with a settlement offer. $5 million in a non-disclosure agreement. You take the money, move somewhere far away, and never speak about EduTech, Garrett, or me again. And if I don't, Rebecca's smile was reptilian, then Jacob discovers evidence of your embezzlement. You get arrested, prosecuted, and convicted. You lose everything and spend the next 2 decades in federal prison. Victoria stood on unsteady legs. You're giving me a choice between exile and imprisonment. I'm giving you a choice between a comfortable life far away and no life at all. Take the 5 million, Victoria. It's more than someone like you deserves. Someone like you. The phrase stung because Victoria recognized the dismissal. To Rebecca Sterling, she was just a small-town teacher who'd gotten lucky, then gotten in the way. I need time to think. You have 48 hours. After that, Jacob begins building the criminal case against you. Victoria walked toward the door on shaking legs. There's one thing I don't understand. If you're really the brains behind EduTech, why do you need Garrett at all? Why not just destroy him too? Rebecca's expression flickered with something that might have been respect. Because Garrett is useful. He's charming. He's good with media. And he has no idea I'm pulling the strings. Useful idiots are valuable. Victoria, they're hard to replace. And I'm not useful. You never were. Victoria left the presidential suite feeling like she'd been hollowed out from the inside. The betrayal by Jacob hurt almost as much as Garrett's affair. She'd trusted the lawyer completely, believed he was her salvation. Now she understood that she'd been alone all along. Back in her car, Victoria sat in the Fairmont's parking garage and tried to process what she'd learned. Rebecca Sterling had orchestrated everything. The affair, the public humiliation, even the legal strategy that was supposed to save her. She thought about the choice Rebecca had given her $5 million in exile. Or prison. There was a third option Rebecca hadn't considered. Victoria could fight back, not through lawyers or journalists, but on her own terms. She pulled out her phone and dialed, Cole Harper. This is Victoria Morrison. I need to see you again. There's more to the story than I told you. Of course. When do you want to meet? Tonight. And Cole, don't trust anyone else with this information. Not your editors, not your sources. No one. There was a pause. Victoria, is everything okay? No, she said quietly. Nothing is okay, but maybe we can change that. Victoria drove home through the Silicon Valley afternoon, her mind racing. Rebecca Sterling thought she was dealing with a helpless victim. She was about to learn otherwise. Victoria arrived at Cole Harper's apartment in Oakland after dark. The neighborhood was a far cry from Silicon Valley's gleaming towers. Narrow Victorian houses squeezed together, street parking, and the distant sound of traffic from the freeway. Cole answered the door in jeans and a wrinkled shirt, looking tired. Come in. You sounded upset on the phone. His apartment was small but comfortable, with overflowing bookshelves and stacks of newspapers covering every surface. The walls were decorated with framed articles, Cole's published work for various magazines and papers. I found out about Jacob, Victoria said without preamble. He's working for Rebecca Sterling. Cole's reaction was immediate and wrong. Instead of shock or concern, he looked nervous. That's a serious accusation, and he said carefully. Do you have proof? Victoria studied his face. There was something off about his response. something that didn't match the concerned journalist persona he'd shown her before. Rebecca showed me bank records, email threads. Jacob took $2 million to betray me. Maybe there's an explanation. These things can be complicated. Victoria's instincts screamed danger. A real journalist would be demanding details, asking for documents, digging deeper into the story. Cole was deflecting. You already knew, she said quietly. Cole's shoulders sagged. Victoria, how long have you been working for her? It's not what you think. How long? Cole sat heavily on his couch. 6 months, maybe longer. Victoria remained standing, every muscle tense. The Wall Street Journal story. There is no Wall Street Journal story. I freelance for them sometimes, but this investigation was private. Rebecca hired me to monitor your movements, your contacts, your plans. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. Cole was the third person in a week who'd offered help while secretly working against her. First Jacob, then Rebecca's revelation about Amber. Now this. The interview questions about EduTech's finances. You were gathering intelligence for Rebecca. She needed to know how much you knew about the company's operations, whether you'd be a credible witness if this went to trial. Victoria laughed bitterly. And your conclusion, you know enough to be dangerous, but not enough to protect yourself. Rebecca's plan would have worked perfectly if you'd just taken Jacob's settlement offer. Would have worked. Cole looked up sharply. You're not taking the settlement. It wasn't a question. Victoria saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed by something that looked like fear. Rebecca underestimated you, he said quietly. She thinks you're just a naive small-town teacher who got in over her head. But you're not, are you? Victoria moved closer to the window, checking the street below. No unusual cars, no one watching the building. But paranoia felt justified now. What was your real assignment? Cole, document your mental state. Build a case that you're unstable, prone to delusions, potentially dangerous. If the embezzlement charges didn't stick, Rebecca wanted a backup plan. Mental incompetence. Something like that. Victoria turned back to him. How much is she paying you? $200,000. More if this drags out. That's a lot of money for a freelance journalist. Cole's laugh was hollow. Do you know how hard it is to make a living in journalism these days? Print media is dying. Most magazines pay pennies per article. When Rebecca offered me real money to investigate corporate corruption, I jumped at it. Even though the investigation was fake, I told myself it might lead to real stories, that I'd eventually expose the truth about EduTech. But you won't. No, I won't. Victoria studied Cole's face. He looked ashamed but not repentant. This was a man who'd sold his integrity for money and was living with the consequences. There's something else, he said reluctantly. Rebecca knows you came to see me tonight. How? Cole held up his phone. GPS tracking, text alerts when you're near my location. She's been monitoring your movements since you hired Jacob. Victoria's blood ran cold. For how long? Months, since before the gala. Rebecca wanted to document your increasing desperation, your unstable behavior. She has photos of you crying in your car, recordings of you leaving desperate voicemails for Garrett, footage of you drinking alone at that bar in Menlo Park. The violation was overwhelming. Victoria thought about all the moments she'd believed she was alone with her grief, her humiliation, her despair. Rebecca Sterling had been watching, recording, building a case against her sanity. She's been planning this for months, Victoria whispered. Longer than that. Rebecca started positioning for your removal 2 years ago, right after EduTech went public. She knew Garrett would eventually want a divorce. Men like him always do. And she wanted to control the narrative. Victoria sank into Cole's desk chair. So none of this was random. The affair, the public humiliation, the legal betrayal, all of it was orchestrated. Rebecca Sterling is the most calculating person I've ever met. She thinks 5 moves ahead and always has contingency plans. What's her endgame? Cole hesitated. Complete control of EduTech. With you gone and Garrett managed through Amber, she runs a $3 billion company from the shadows. No oversight, no challenges to her authority. And if I don't cooperate, federal prison for embezzlement or a psychiatric hold for mental incompetence. Rebecca has enough fabricated evidence and paid witnesses to support either narrative. Victoria closed her eyes. Rebecca Sterling had built a perfect trap. Every path forward led to Victoria's destruction, except one. Cole, I need you to do something for me. Victoria, I can't. Rebecca will destroy me if I cross her. She's going to destroy you anyway. You know too much about her methods. Once I'm handled, you become a liability. Cole's face went pale. Victoria could see him processing the implications. What do you want me to do? Keep feeding Rebecca information. But start feeding her lies. Make her think I'm more broken than I am, more isolated, more likely to take the settlement. And meanwhile, I'm going to do what Rebecca doesn't expect. I'm going to disappear. Cole frowned. You mean run away? Victoria smiled for the first time in days. I mean strategically retreat. Rebecca thinks she knows me, but she's wrong. She thinks I'm a small-town teacher who stumbled into Silicon Valley and got lucky. What she doesn't know is that small-town teachers are the most resourceful people on earth. We solve problems with no money, no support, and hostile administrators breathing down our necks. What's your plan? I'm going to give Rebecca Sterling exactly what she deserves. But first, I need to become someone she doesn't recognize. Victoria stood and moved toward the door. Keep reporting to Rebecca. Tell her I seemed delusional tonight, that I was talking about conspiracy theories and making wild accusations. Make her think I'm having a breakdown. Where are you going? Victoria paused at the door. To get help from someone Rebecca Sterling has never heard of. Someone who actually cares whether I live or die. Victoria, be careful. Rebecca has resources you can't imagine. So did the administrators who tried to shut down my literacy program. So did the school board members who wanted to cut special education funding. So did my ex-principal who thought teachers should stay quiet and follow orders. Victoria's voice grew stronger with each word. The thing about small-town teachers, Cole, is that we don't quit when powerful people try to intimidate us. We get creative. She left Cole staring after her, his face a mixture of admiration and terror. Victoria had 47 hours left on Rebecca's ultimatum, time enough to call in the one ally Rebecca Sterling could never anticipate or understand. Time to go home to Ohio. Victoria drove through the night, pushing her rental car east toward Ohio. She ditched her phone in a San Francisco dumpster and paid cash for everything: gas, food, the car itself. If Rebecca Sterling wanted to track her movements, she'd have to work for it. The Midwest landscape rolled past in pre-dawn darkness. Victoria hadn't seen these flat horizons and endless cornfields since her parents' funeral 3 years ago. Coming home felt like traveling backward through time. She pulled into Millfield, Ohio, just as the sun was rising. Population 8,000, one main street, 3 churches, and a diner that had served the same menu since 1965. This was the world Victoria had escaped from, the life she'd been so eager to leave behind. Now it might be her salvation. Sarah Blake lived in a small house on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the elementary school where Victoria used to teach. Sarah was the only person from Victoria's old life who'd stayed in touch after the California move, the only friend who'd called after the gala video went viral. Victoria parked outside the white frame house with its neat flower garden and front porch swing. It looked like something from a Norman Rockwell painting compared to the sleek modernism of Silicon Valley. Sarah opened the door before Victoria could knock. She was a tiny woman in her early 30s with short black hair and wire-rimmed glasses. Sarah taught 4th grade and coached the robotics team, somehow managing to be both the most gentle and most fierce person Victoria had ever met. "Oh, honey," Sarah said, pulling Victoria into a hug. "You look terrible." Victoria started crying for the first time since leaving California. All the betrayal, all the manipulation, all the careful control she'd been maintaining finally cracked. Sarah held her while she sobbed on the front porch of a house in small-town Ohio. "Come inside," Sarah said gently. "We have a lot to talk about." Sarah's living room was cluttered with student artwork, robotics equipment, and stacks of graded papers. It felt more like home than the Atherton mansion ever had. "Tell me everything," Sarah said, settling Victoria on the couch with a cup of coffee. Victoria explained the entire nightmare: Rebecca Sterling's manipulation, Jacob's betrayal, Cole's surveillance, the fabricated embezzlement evidence, The ultimatum exilum, or imprisonment. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Victoria finished, Sarah was quiet for a long moment. This Rebecca Sterling thinks she's very smart. Sarah finally said, "She is smart. She's been 5 steps ahead of me from the beginning." "No, she's been 5 steps ahead of the person she thinks you are, but she doesn't actually know you. Victoria, she knows your biography, but she doesn't understand who you really are." Yeah, Sarah stood and moved to her computer desk. "Do you remember the Henderson situation?" Victoria smiled despite her exhaustion. The Henderson situation had been Sarah's masterpiece of strategic warfare disguised as elementary education. "Remind me, 3 years ago, the school board wanted to shut down the special education program. Budget cuts. They figured disabled kids were too expensive and too much trouble." Sarah's voice hardened. "The board chairman, Bill Henderson, owned half the real estate in town. He wanted to sell the special ed building to a developer." "I remember you were furious." "I was, but I didn't get angry in public. Instead, I spent 6 months documenting every financial irregularity in the school budget. I traced shell companies, analyzed vendor contracts, cross-referenced board members' business interests with district spending." Victoria sat up straighter. "You built a corruption case." "Exactly. And when Henderson called the board meeting to vote on shutting down special education, I presented my findings. Turns out Henderson had been funneling district money to his own companies for years. Overpriced construction contracts, inflated supply costs, property deals that benefited him personally. What happened?" Sarah's smile was sharp. "Henderson resigned in disgrace. The FBI launched an investigation. The school board voted unanimously to expand the special education program, and our kids got the resources they deserved." Victoria felt a spark of something she hadn't experienced in months' hope. "You think I can do something similar to Rebecca?" "I think Rebecca Sterling is about to learn what happens when you underestimate a public school teacher with research skills and nothing left to lose." Sarah opened her laptop. "Tell me everything you remember about EduTech's finances. Every document you signed, every conversation you overheard, every detail you thought was unimportant." They worked for hours. Sarah took notes while Victoria reconstructed years of memories about EduTech's operations. Conversations between Garrett and Rebecca that hadn't made sense at the time. Financial documents Victoria had glimpsed but not understood. Business meetings where she'd been present but ignored. "Here's what I think happened," Sarah said, reviewing her notes. "Rebecca Sterling has been running a massive embezzlement scheme for years, but she's been smart about it. Instead of stealing directly, she's inflated costs, created fake vendors, and skimmed money through legitimate-looking transactions. But how do we prove it? The same way I proved Henderson's corruption. We follow the money." Sarah turned her laptop screen toward Victoria. "I've been taking online courses in forensic accounting and financial investigation. Turns out the skills you need to analyze school budgets aren't so different from the skills you need to catch corporate criminals." Victoria stared at the screen. Sarah had built a complex spreadsheet tracking EduTech's public financial reports, cross-referenced with news articles about the company's growth. "There are patterns here," Sarah continued. "Cost overruns that coincide with Rebecca's travel schedule, consulting fees paid to companies that don't seem to exist, marketing expenses that are way out of line with industry standards. This is incredible work, but Rebecca controls all the internal documents. We can't access the real evidence." Sarah smiled. "We don't need to access it. We just need to make the right people curious enough to look for themselves." "What people?" "The SEC, the FBI, EduTech's board of directors. See, Rebecca's been so focused on controlling you and Garrett that she forgot about external oversight. She's been filing false reports with federal agencies for years." Victoria felt her pulse quicken. "So we report her. Better than that, we give other people reasons to investigate her independently. I've been researching investigative journalists, financial regulators, and corporate watchdog groups, people who would love to expose Silicon Valley corruption." Sarah pulled up another file. Contact information for dozens of reporters, regulators, and activists. The beautiful thing about this approach is that Rebecca can't control or corrupt everyone. She might be able to buy off one lawyer or one journalist, but she can't buy off the entire federal government. Victoria studied the list of contacts. This could actually work. It will work, but we need to be smart about timing and presentation. We can't look like we're making wild accusations. We need to provide credible leads that professional investigators can follow up on. How long will that take? Sarah checked her watch. Rebecca's ultimatum expires in 36 hours. We need to move fast. They spent the rest of the day crafting careful communications to reporters, regulators, and oversight agencies. Each message was different, tailored to the recipient's interests and expertise. They weren't making accusations. They were asking questions and providing public information that suggested further investigation might be warranted. By evening, they'd sent 43 carefully crafted messages to journalists, investigators, and regulatory officials across the country. Now we wait, Sarah said. Victoria looked around Sarah's cluttered living room. Student artwork covered the refrigerator. Robotics trophies lined the mantelpiece. Everything here represented Sarah's commitment to education, to children, to making the world better one classroom at a time. Why are you helping me? Victoria asked. This could destroy your career if it goes wrong. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Do you remember why you became a teacher? To help kids learn. And do you remember what you told me about why you left teaching for edutech? Victoria smiled sadly. I thought technology could help me reach more children. I thought I could have a bigger impact. Exactly. You left teaching because you wanted to help more kids, not because you wanted money or status. That's who you really are. Victoria, someone who puts children first. Sarah's voice grew fierce. Rebecca Sterling has been using educational technology to enrich herself while actual teachers struggle with underfunded classrooms and outdated equipment. She's profiting off the idea of helping children while doing nothing to actually help them. So this isn't just about me. This is about every teacher who's been told that Silicon Valley knows better than educators. This is about every child whose school can't afford basic supplies, while tech companies make billions off educational software. Victoria felt something shifting inside her chest. The crack that had been growing since the gala was filling with something stronger than anger or despair. It was filling with purpose. What's our next move? She asked. Sarah pulled up a secure email account on her laptop. We've already received 3 responses. A reporter from the Washington Post wants to know more about edutech's vendor relationships. An SE investigator is asking about Rebecca's financial disclosures, and a FBI agent specializing in corporate fraud thinks your information might connect to a larger investigation they're already conducting. Victoria stared at the screen. It's working. It's just the beginning. Rebecca Sterling built her empire by staying in the shadows and controlling information. But shadows disappear when you shine enough light on them. Victoria's phone, a new burner phone Sarah had bought that afternoon, buzzed with a text from an unknown number. 48 hours are up. Jacob is filing criminal charges tomorrow unless you sign the settlement. This is your last chance. R.S. Victoria showed the message to Sarah. Perfect timing, Sarah said. Let's see how confident Rebecca feels about filing criminal charges when federal investigators start asking questions about her own financial activities. Victoria typed a response. File whatever charges you want. I'm done being afraid of you. She hit send and turned off the phone. Now what? Sarah smiled. Now we go to work. Real work. The kind teachers do when powerful people try to intimidate us. Which is, we teach them that they picked the wrong fight with the wrong woman. For the first time since the gala, Victoria felt like herself again. Not Garrett's wife or Rebecca's victim, but Victoria Hayes, the teacher who'd never backed down from a bully in her life. Rebecca Sterling was about to get an education. Victoria woke up in Sarah's guest room to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently. 23 missed calls from unknown numbers. 47 text messages. Her email inbox was overflowing. Sarah, she called, rushing to the living room. Sarah was already at her computer, scrolling through news websites with a huge grin on her face. Victoria, come look at this. The Washington Post homepage featured a massive headline, Silicon Valley Education Giant Under Federal Investigation for Fraud. Below it, a smaller story, EduTech CFO Rebecca Sterling's financial empire built on deception. Sources say, and another FBI raids EduTech headquarters in multi-million-dollar embezzlement probe. Victoria sank into a chair, staring at the screen. This is really happening. It gets better. Sarah clicked to the tech industry news sites. TechCrunch, Wired, Ars Technica. Every major publication was running versions of the same story. EduTech's stock price had crashed overnight. Trading was suspended pending investigation. How did this happen so fast? Sarah pulled up her secure email. Remember that FBI agent who responded to our inquiry? Turns out the Bureau has been investigating Silicon Valley financial fraud for months. Our information about Rebecca gave them the missing piece they needed to get search warrants. Victoria's phone rang. She recognized Jacob Winter's number and answered on speaker. Victoria, what the hell did you do? Jacob's voice was shaking. I got educated about the legal system. Turns out federal investigators don't like lawyers who fabricate evidence. The FBI seized all my files. They're asking about payments from shell companies. My career is over. Good. You should have thought about that before you decided to frame an innocent woman. Rebecca Sterling is going to kill me. Literally. Victoria felt a chill. What do you mean? She's desperate. The federal investigation is moving too fast for her to cover her tracks. She's talking about eliminating loose ends. The line went dead. Sarah and Victoria stared at each other. We need to call the FBI, Sarah said. Before Victoria could respond, her phone rang again. This time it was Cole Harper. Victoria, thank God. Are you safe? I'm fine. What's happening on your end? Rebecca's in full panic mode. She knows the investigation is moving fast, and she's trying to destroy evidence. She offered me $500,000 to say you confessed to embezzlement during our interview. Are you going to take it? Cole's laugh was bitter. I already gave the FBI recordings of all my conversations with Rebecca. Turns out journalism school actually taught me something about ethics after all. What about Garrett? That's the interesting part. Garrett's cooperating with investigators. He claims he had no idea Rebecca was embezzling, says he thought she was just a brilliant business partner. Victoria felt a stab of something that might have been sympathy for her ex-husband. Do you believe him? Actually, yeah, I think Garrett is exactly what Rebecca said he was. A useful idiot. He's narcissistic and cruel, but he's not a criminal mastermind. Rebecca played him just like she played everyone else. Victoria's phone beeped with an incoming call. Unknown number, but she recognized the area code. Silicon Valley. I have to go, she told Cole. Be careful. She switched to the new call. Hello, Victoria. Rebecca Sterling's voice was ice cold. You've made a terrible mistake. Have I? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like I made exactly the right choice. The FBI can't protect you forever. I have resources they don't know about. People who owe me favors. This isn't over. Victoria looked at Sarah, who was frantically trying to trace the call on her computer. You're right, Victoria said calmly. It's not over, but it's not going the way you planned, either. You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've destroyed bigger threats than a small-town teacher. Maybe, but you've never dealt with a small-town teacher who had nothing left to lose. And you've definitely never dealt with a small-town teacher who had help from other small-town teachers. Sarah held up a note. Call is being recorded by FBI. Keep her talking. What do you that wanted to mean? Rebecca demanded. It means you underestimated the network you were dealing with. You thought I was isolated. But teachers are never really alone. We look out for each other. We share information. We collaborate. Teachers, Rebecca's voice was contemptuous. You think a bunch of underpaid public school teachers can challenge me? Victoria smiled. I think a bunch of underpaid public school teachers with graduate degrees in research, analysis, and problem solving might be exactly what the FBI needed to crack your financial schemes. There was silence on the line. You see, Rebecca, you made the same mistake a lot of powerful people make. You confused credentials with intelligence. You thought because Shura and I work in public education, we must not be as smart as Silicon Valley executives. Sarah gave her a thumbs up and mouthed, keep going. But here's what you missed. Teachers spend every day solving complex problems with limited resources. We analyze data, identify patterns, and find creative solutions to seemingly impossible challenges. And we do it all while managing 30 different personalities in a single classroom. This is ridiculous. Is it because right now, federal agents are using analysis techniques Sarah learned in her graduate education courses to trace your financial schemes? They're following leads developed by teacher research skills. They're building cases using the same systematic approach we use to track student progress. Rebecca's breathing was audible on the line. You could have won this easily, Victoria continued. If you just treated me with basic human decency, I would have taken a reasonable divorce settlement and disappeared quietly. But you had to be cruel. You had to humiliate me. You had to make it personal. I was protecting my business. You were feeding your ego, and that's what's going to destroy you. Sarah held up another note. FBI traced the call. They're moving to arrest her now. Rebecca, I have one last piece of advice for you. What? Never underestimate a teacher. We might not have your money or your connections, but we have something you don't understand. We have integrity. We have community, and we never, ever give up on doing what's right. Victoria could hear sirens in the background of Rebecca's call. This isn't over, Rebecca repeated, but her voice had lost its confidence. Yes, it is. Victoria hung up and turned to Sarah. Is it really over? Look for yourself. Sarah turned her laptop screen toward Victoria. Breaking news alerts were flashing across every major news site. Silicon Valley CFO arrested in massive fraud scheme. EduTech scandal expands as federal investigators uncover years of embezzlement. Teachers' courage exposes corporate corruption. Victoria's phone rang one more time. She looked at the caller ID and her heart stopped. Garrett, Victoria. Her ex-husband's voice was subdued. I'm calling to apologize. Victoria wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Apologize. For everything. The affair, the gala, the way I treated you. I just spent 6 hours with federal investigators learning what Rebecca was really doing, learning how she manipulated both of us. Victoria sat down heavily. Garrett, I can't deal with this right now. I know. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm just asking you to know that I'm sorry. And I'm sorry about the baby. That was unforgivable. Victoria felt tears starting. Why now? Why are you telling me this now? Because I finally understand what I lost. Rebecca showed me financial projections proving you weren't valuable to the company. But the FBI showed me something else. They showed me that every major innovation EduTech developed in the first 2 years came from ideas you suggested, your educational insights, your user experience feedback, your understanding of what teachers actually needed. Victoria was crying now. Garrett, you were never the problem, Victoria. You were the solution. And I was too stupid and too arrogant to see it. This doesn't fix anything. I know, but maybe it's a start. Garrett's voice was soft. The investigators are going to need your testimony about the early days of EduTech, about Rebecca's role, about the ideas she stole from you. Will you help them? Victoria looked at Sarah, who nodded encouragingly. Yes, Victoria said. I'll help them. Not for you, but because it's the right thing to do. Thank you. Garrett, what's going to happen to EduTech? I don't know that the board is in crisis mode. The stock is worthless. We might lose everything. And Amber, Garrett was quiet for a moment. Amber disappeared the moment the FBI started asking questions. Turns out she was working for Rebecca all along. I never meant anything to her. Victoria almost felt sorry for him. Almost. I have to go, she said. Victoria, for what it's worth, I hope you find happiness. Real happiness. You deserve it. Victoria hung up and buried her face in her hands. Sarah sat beside her on the couch. How do you feel? Sarah asked gently. Exhausted, relieved, angry, sad. Victoria looked up. Is it terrible that part of me still feels bad for Garrett? It's not terrible. It means you're a good person. That's why you survived this and Rebecca didn't. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Miss Morrison, this is Agent Jennifer Walsh, FBI. Could you come to our San Francisco office tomorrow? We need your testimony to complete the case against Rebecca Sterling. Victoria showed the text to Sarah. Ready to go back to California? Sarah asked. Victoria thought about it. 24 hours ago, she'd been facing exile or imprisonment. Now she was being asked to help federal investigators complete the biggest corporate fraud case in Silicon Valley history. Actually, I think I am ready. 6 months later, Victoria stood outside the federal courthouse in San Francisco, watching news crews pack up their equipment. The Rebecca Sterling trial had lasted 8 weeks and dominated headlines across the country. Today, the jury had delivered their verdict. Guilty on all charges, Rebecca Sterling would spend the next 25 years in federal prison for embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The woman who'd orchestrated Victoria's destruction was led away in handcuffs. Her perfect composure finally cracked. Victoria felt a hand on her shoulder. Agent Jennifer Walsh, the FBI investigator who'd become something like a friend during the long months of testimony and depositions. "How are you holding up?" Agent Walsh asked. "I keep expecting to feel more satisfied." Victoria said, "But mostly I just feel tired." "That's normal. Justice is important, but it doesn't erase what you went through." The trial had been brutal. Rebecca's defense team had tried to paint Victoria as a vengeful ex-wife, making false accusations. They'd brought up her miscarriage, her depression, her suicide attempt, but the evidence was overwhelming. The FBI's investigation had uncovered a financial conspiracy that stretched back nearly a decade. Rebecca had embezzled over $60 million from EduTech and other companies she'd secretly controlled. Jacob Winters had pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and would serve 2 years in federal prison. Cole Harper had cooperated with the investigators and avoided criminal charges, but his journalism career was over. "What about Garrett?" Victoria asked. "No criminal charges. The investigation confirmed he was manipulated, not complicit, but EduTech is finished. The company's being liquidated to pay back investors." Victoria felt complicated emotions about her ex-husband's fate. Garrett had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his fortune. But he'd testified truthfully during the trial and acknowledged his cruelty to Victoria. That evening, Victoria met Garrett at a quiet restaurant near the financial district. She'd agreed to the dinner reluctantly, unsure what they could possibly have to say to each other. Garrett looked older, thinner, worn down by months of legal battles and public humiliation. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," he said quietly. "I almost didn't." They ordered food neither of them really wanted and sat in awkward silence. "The investigators made me go through all of Rebecca's manipulation tactics," Garrett finally said. "They showed me how she engineered our separation, how she used Amber to control me, how she orchestrated your humiliation." Victoria waited. "None of that excuses my behavior. I chose to have an affair. I chose to humiliate you at the gala. I chose cruelty over compassion." Garrett's voice was pained. "But I want you to understand that the man who kicked his pregnant wife wasn't really me. He was who Rebecca Sterling wanted me to become." Victoria considered this. "Maybe, but he was still you. Garrett, you still made those choices." "I know, and I'll regret them for the rest of my life." "What will you do now?" she asked. "Maybe go back to coding. Start over somewhere no one knows my name." Garrett looked up. "What about you?" "I'm going to start a nonprofit, educational technology for underserved communities. Real technology that actually helps teachers and students." Garrett's eyes lit up. "That's brilliant. That's what EduTech was supposed to be. Maybe you could help," Victoria said impulsively. "After everything I did to you." Victoria thought about it. 6 months ago, working with Garrett again would have been unthinkable. But the trial had changed both of them. "I'm not offering because I forgive you," Victoria said carefully. "I'm offering because the work is too important to let personal history get in the way. Kids need better educational tools." "There's one condition," she continued. "No equity, no ownership stake. You work for the mission, not for profit. And if you ever lie to me again, you're out." "Fair enough." Victoria extended her hand across the table. "Partners, for the work. Nothing else." Garrett shook her hand. "For the work." Have you ever been in a situation where you had to decide whether to work with someone who'd hurt you deeply? It's one of the hardest choices we face, balancing justice with pragmatism, personal healing with larger purposes. Victoria was choosing to put her mission above her pain, not because she'd forgotten what Garrett had done, but because she'd found something more important than revenge. As they left the restaurant, Victoria felt something she hadn't experienced in years: peace. Not the kind that comes from getting everything you want, but the kind that comes from knowing you've made decisions based on your values, not your emotions. 1 year later, Victoria stood in front of a classroom filled with teachers from across the country. The Education Technology Innovation Conference had drawn nearly 1,000 educators to Chicago, all eager to learn about tools that might actually help them do their jobs better. The most important thing to remember, Victoria said into her microphone, is that technology should serve education, not the other way around. Every app, every platform, every digital tool should make it easier for teachers to teach and students to learn. The audience nodded appreciatively. These were people who'd been burned by previous promises of technological revolution. 6 months ago, we launched the Educational Technology Alliance, Victoria continued. It's a nonprofit dedicated to developing tools that teachers actually want and students actually need. She clicked to her next slide, showing their first product, a classroom management system designed entirely by working teachers. This platform was created by teachers. For teachers, it handles attendance, grading, and parent communication without requiring you to learn 17 different interfaces. The response was enthusiastic. After her presentation, Victoria was surrounded by educators wanting to know more about the Alliance's work. Later that evening, Victoria sat in her hotel room video chatting with Sarah, who still taught fourth grade in Ohio, but also served on the Alliance's board. "How was the presentation?" Sarah asked. "Good, really good. I think we're finally reaching the teachers who need these tools most." "And how's working with Garrett going?" "Awkward but necessary. We're still figuring out how to be colleagues instead of former spouses. But the work is going well." They talked about the Alliance's upcoming projects and their shared dream of revolutionizing educational technology from the ground up. After hanging up, Victoria walked to her hotel window and looked out at the Chicago skyline. 2 years ago, she'd been in the same city meeting Garrett for the first time. She'd been a small-town teacher excited about reaching more students through technology. In some ways, she was back where she started. But everything was different now. Her phone buzzed with an email from the Alliance's development team. Their classroom management platform had reached 50,000 active users, with overwhelmingly positive reviews from teachers. Her phone rang. Unknown number, but she recognized the area code. Silicon Valley. "Hello, Victoria. This is Jennifer Walsh. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Agent Walsh, is everything okay?" "I'm actually Dr. Walsh now. I left the FBI and finished my PhD in criminology. I'm calling because I have a proposition for you." Victoria was intrigued. "What kind of proposition?" "Stanford wants to offer you a position, Professor of Practice in Education Technology. You'd teach graduate courses and lead research into ethical technology development." Victoria nearly dropped the phone. "Stanford wants to hire me. You're exactly what they need, someone who understands both education and technology, who has real-world experience with corporate accountability." After Jennifer hung up, Victoria sat quietly for a long time. A year ago, she'd been fighting for her survival. Tonight, Stanford University was offering her a chance to shape the future of educational technology. She thought about that moment when powerful people try to convince you that you're powerless. Rebecca Sterling had built her entire strategy on that assumption, but Victoria had learned something important during her year of recovery. The people who tell you that you're powerless are usually the ones most afraid of your power. Victoria opened her laptop and began writing in the journal she'd kept since leaving California. Today marks exactly 1 year since Rebecca Sterling was sentenced. I used to think justice meant she got punished for what she did to me. Now I understand that justice means building something better from the wreckage she left behind. The Educational Technology Alliance has helped over 200,000 students this year. We've created tools that actually work for teachers. We've proven that technology companies can serve education instead of exploiting it. Rebecca Sterling thought she could destroy me by taking away everything I valued. She didn't understand that what I valued most was my ability to help children learn and grow. She never could have taken that away from me. And now, instead of helping a few dozen students in Ohio, I'm helping hundreds of thousands across the country. Victoria closed her journal and got ready for bed. Outside her hotel window, Chicago glittered with possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new chances to make a difference. She'd learned that revenge was temporary, but building something meaningful lasted forever. Rebecca Sterling would spend the next 25 years in prison, but Victoria Hayes would spend the next 25 years transforming education. As she turned off the lights, Victoria smiled. She'd kept the promise she made to herself in that hospital room 2 years ago. She'd survived. She'd fought back. And she'd proved that when a woman decides to rise, nothing can keep her down. The billionaire's brutal betrayal had destroyed everything weak, everything built on lies, everything that needed to be torn down so something better could take its place. And from those ashes, Victoria Hayes had built an empire of her own. Not an empire of money or manipulation, but an empire of service, integrity, and hope. It was the kind of empire that would last.